Evening and veel like Behar. Hope you can hear me. Just check. So good evening, and start off going to straight away with the first question, which came earlier in the week. So someone asks, there is a halacha about in Muktzah of a parent not to refer to a parent by name. What about if your parent is called Moshe and you have someone in the room called Moshe? Are you allowed to call that person Moshe by name in the presence of your parent? And what happens if the parent is moichel? Does that solve the problem? So here we have the first thing we have from the Shulchan Aruch, Yeridea, and it has here the halacha of v'lo yikra'enu b'shmoi. One should not refer to the father by name. Neither in his lifetime nor after he's passed away. And when one refers to the father, it's Abba Mori, my father. Then what about if someone else has the same name as the father? So then Meshana Shmom Imhu Shem Shu Peli. If his father's name is an unusual name, so then it's not a common name, then you would not use the father's then you'd somehow refer to the other person slightly different, not to the way your father was called. But then there are more adds. If it's a regular common name, so so when not in the parents' presence, so you could call Moshe, even though your father's name is Moshe, because it's a shame sherigilin boy. If your father's name was quite unusual, then happens to be someone else who also has that unusual name, you'd be more limited. But if your father is called a name, which is a common name, so you can refer to other people in their absence. What about in their presence? So far, it seems to be that's not allowed. In this tshuva, which you see on the margin here on the screen from Igros Moshe, so he takes it a little bit further, and he says that, let's say the father was always known as Harav or Reb Moshe, and there's someone there called Moichel. So then the reason, no one calls your father Moichel. Therefore, the whole reason why you shouldn't be referring to other people by name with your father's name, or for anything with a girl to with the mother's name, that they shouldn't get the impression that, even for a moment, that the child had referred to the father or mother by their first name. For this reason, you don't call other people by name in their presence. But if no one calls the father the same way as you are calling that other person, although they have the same name, then that would be okay. That would be mutter. Then further on, Reb Moshe writes, if the father is moichel, then that's not a problem. He then refers to Reb Kiva Eger, who quotes from the Radvaz, that there is a mitzvah to refrain from using a parent's name, even if they are moichel. And therefore, certainly on the level of a hidur mitzvah, at least, to avoid using a parent's name, even in their presence, for calling someone else, even if they are moichel. I just want to add two uvdas, two facts. There was Rabbi Reb Sholem Ber Eichhorn, was a Meshamesh B'Kodesh in the house of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So when the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived in America, he did need to have physical assistance, and Reb Shalom Ba'Eichon was a tall, broad-shouldered fella, and so he physically helped the Rebbe in a lot of to be lifted, etc. He was called Shalom Bear, named after the Rebbe Rashab, evidently. But in the house, they never called him Shalom Bear. He was called Eichhorn. So it's not in the Rebbe Rashab's presence. Possibly you could say it's extra zehidus of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He saw his father before his eyes, so he didn't want to refer to someone else with the name Shalom Bear. So he referred to him by his surname. Secondly, I heard that in the Rebbe's house, there was a Meshamash Bakodesh by the name of Reb Mendel Notik. There's a Bocher at the time. They never referred to him as Mendel. The Rebbe's house, that name was the Rebbe's name. So he was, whatever they called him, Notik, or whatever else they called him, but they avoided using his name Mendel. So it shouldn't be perceived even for a moment that someone's referring to the Rebbe by first name, which would be disrespectful. We go on to the next point. Now, this is a shiur, quite a common shiur. That's why I felt it's important to address. Putting on tefillin, you find someone that you have really very little contact, but they asked you to officiate at the funeral. You never see him in a weekday. And if you do, he declines to put on tefillin. But before Levaya, he's perhaps a bit more vulnerable, a bit more subdued, and is ready to put on tefillin. So is it okay, or is it a good idea, or is it not a good idea? So it's like, it's the only time you're going to get him, but it's not the time to put on tefillin. Is it oinen, his potter, and his actually the poshta halocha is that he should not be putting on tefillin. Let's explain it perhaps a little bit. Tefillin is pe'er, is glory, and a person is a state of grief is the opposite. Is in a moment, word disgrace may not be the right word, but it's not. The halacha is potter min tefillin, is potter mikol mitzvahs. Doesn't say broches as an oinen until the kavura. He's potter min tefillin, and so I don't see the idea of putting on tefillin with him when it's not a kiyum ha-mitzvah. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the second point is even after the levaya. So the halacha is that the oval is potter min tefillin, also aniach tefillin, even after the levaya until not sunset. In this inyan of putting on tefillin after the levaya, that's where Chabad have a minhag of putting on tefillin late after the levaya. That's where you have. Here's a quote from a Sikha. You can see where it's from. Teres Menachem Cherek Chof. The Rebbe says, when I visited the Satmar Rov for Nichum Avelim, I mentioned that the minhag is to put on tefillin b'yom rishon, even b'yom rishon, and he was very surprised because the Shulchan Aruch says the opposite, as you can just see. However, in the Sefer Ma'avar Yaboik, mentioned several times the Sefer Ma'avar Yaboik, he mentions there there are those who do not refrain from tefillin, not on the first day of Avelis nor on Tisha B'Av, and that's the idea of the word of Neshamas G'daylis K'mei Rashbi, which is very appropriate for today. Their churban didn't take place, so that's what that level is. That they put on tefillin ke'ilu the churban didn't take place. Now, also in connection to Sefirahetc, so coming back to the thing, if an oinen did put on tefillin, was it a mitzvah or not? It's potter min mitzvahs, but was it a mitzvah? So there is a question about, let's say, if there's an oinen who has a bris to be done, his own child or another child. So first of all, if it's his own child, there's a marshal who writes that he can and should do the bris on his own child, even though he's an oinen, and for whatever legislation, he's not going to be able to, the kavura won't be today, and he still will do the bris. So in other words, we see that the act of the mitzvah it's a mitzvah act. In Noda B'Yehuda, he talks about if a person becomes an oinen during Sefirahetc, do they count without a brach? Okay, the potter min brachas, but what about what about the actual Sefira? Because if they don't do Sefira now, so they're not only going to jeopardize the mitzvah now, they're going to also jeopardize for mitzvahs later. So the Noda B'Yehuda says they should count, perhaps without a bracha. They might have a note here, Maram Shik, who was a Talmud of Chassam Sofer. It was a moichel who was an oinen, and he said he should do the bris if there's no other moichel, but he shouldn't wear tefillin. So coming back, is there a kiyum mitzvah? So there seems to be some latitude, if that's the word, that the oinen who does a mitzvah, it is a kiyum mitzvah, but there's certainly no chiyuv at all for an oinen to be putting on tefillin, and therefore I wouldn't advise it, because Pashtus Shulchan Aruch is that they should not be doing mitzvahs. Afterwards, make a home visit and be mezakeh them. It's easier said than done, but that's all I can say. Okay, let's move on to something. So I got here an email from someone who's perhaps more into general knowledge. He wanted to understand what would be the attitude of halacha towards automated melacha being done on Shabbos. So he understands. Torah says that we're not allowed to do melacha. Your animal is not allowed to do melacha. It says in Torah, so they have got a nefesh, but a robot, etc. He sent me a fascinating video of 14 different robots. Some of them are really up to amazing stuff. And so here you have, I took one clip of a robot who's, you can see there's a pot in the fire, and the robot will pour exactly the ingredients and control and cook and make you a whole soup or a whole goulash, whatever it may be. The robot can do it all for you, and you can set it in motion from before. And so this is the question. Use of automated equipment on Shabbos. What I see as a common application of this is these vacuum cleaners, which they sit in the corner of the room, and then when the clock strikes 12, they start zooming around, and then they find their way around the whole room, a couple of rooms, the whole floor, and then after half an hour, they go back to sleep. And whether that can be done on Shabbos, can they be set in motion? They do it every night. Can they be left to go in to do the hoovering, the vacuuming on Shabbos? So particularly Reb Moshe Feinstein is the one who's quite outspoken about this. And the way I heard was that someone had asked Reb Moshe, is it okay to set your TV on a timer so on Shabbos afternoon you can watch the World Series or the Yankees playing the Dodgers? Don't ask me any more details, but something like that. And Reb Moshe was really upset about this, about the question. But he writes his tshuva about automated things on Shabbos. And he says, and we have to understand, we have a concept of amiru l'nochri, that we're not allowed to ask a goy to do a melacha for us on Shabbos. Why is amiru l'nochri forbidden? So a Lubavitcher will tell you, because the goy is like your shliach. The Alter Rebbe says, a goy, yes, shlichus la'akum l'chumra, he's like your shliach midrabanon, to give him a status of shlichus. That's not the Alter Rebbe's chiddush. It's written in Hagoyos Maimonis, and I think Perek Hey Amichas Shabbos. But that's the framework. That it's what they asked. They Chacham forbade this, and they said, "I'm going to give it a framework shlichus." The question is, what's the motive? Why did the Chacham see the need to create such a isur? And that is clear in Poskim. They say zilus of the Shabbos, shilzil ha-Shabbos. If of the disgrace of Shabbos or cheapening of Shabbos, you could theoretically have a whole industry. You can have a shop selling and producing, manufacturing, and you're just sitting there at your desk and giving instructions to this one, the other one. You have a whole crew of goyshe workers, and you could have Shabbos mamish like a weekday. And so that's what obviously would be a gross, how do you say, compromise on the atmosphere of Shabbos, and so zilus of the Shabbos. Okay, so then what about then lighting and heating? And the alternative, the parallel, the air conditioning. So Reb Moshe says that's not a problem. That's okay. And he explains about quite very rationally. In times bygone, 100 years ago, whatever, so they didn't have automated central heating. So how did they not freeze on Shabbos afternoon? There was a Shabbos guy. The Shabbos guy would come in on Shabbos afternoon and put some coal in the fireplace, and that's how you can live for hundreds of years. So therefore, the fact that the house is warm on Shabbos, if a goy is allowed to be brought in, so for sure you can have a time switch doing the same thing. You can't call it zilzul Shabbos, the fact that it's warm, because you can even have a goy do it for you. What about lighting? So generally, having a goy coming to put on the light is not okay. But he does bring, Reb Moshe brings, that there were communities where a guy would be coming in on Yom Kippur late afternoon, switch to light some candles, so people should be able to say Ne'ilah. Otherwise, their candles, I guess, would not last for 24 hours. So although we wouldn't allow, but it has apparently was done. So therefore, things like lighting and heating, so those things happening by time switch are not to be considered a interference to the atmosphere of Shabbos. But something, as I said, there's robots doing this and that and making noise and doing things which are normally done at the time of usage. So then those things should be avoided on Shabbos. This idea of a robot running around hoovering your floor on Shabbos, and it makes quite a bit of noise. So those things are not recommended, at least. Say it's absolute Isur is difficult to say, but certainly not recommended because of this idea of Zilzal HaShabbos. And this is what these Sforim are writing, that one should not use automated equipment on Shabbos, not because it's Usur as a Malocha, not because it's like your animal which has a life, but because of just the same as a Mir al-Nochri, Zilusa de Shabbato. So the same thing, radio, etc. Of course, there are exceptional circumstances. In the case of people asked people on Ukraine were asking at the beginning of the war whether they could leave the radio on Shabbos. That's in exceptional circumstances. But on a regular basis, to have equipment working on Shabbos is not in the spirit of Shabbos. Someone is asking a very good question. I don't know the answer. Going back to about the idea not mentioning a father's name. Why is it okay to give your name when you're called up to the Torah if the father is there and you're saying your father's name? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure of the answer. Possibly that itself is part of an act of cover. You're saying, I don't know, but a good question. Let's move on. Okay. This is a very interesting one. Now, we've seen all these e-scooters, and soll sei gesund. But now someone came up with, I think, a brilliant idea, that a mother pushing a buggy, sometimes it's uphill, and it's a struggle to go uphill, sometimes it's downhill, it's also a bit of, you have to control it, and sometimes there's a bit of gravel, or so they've invented a pram or buggy, which has a electrical motor, which assists it to be able to roll more easily. So obviously, we're not talking about using the electrical aspect on Shabbos. It's a buggy, like any other buggy, just the price is about twice as much, but it's and it has this motor. It has a battery which you plug it in at night, leave it to overnight charge. Next morning, you're ready to go. So what about if it's for Shabbos, if you remove the battery before Shabbos, is it still called a keli shemalachta le'isur? Is it Muktzah? I don't think so. I don't have any solid proof, but we'll see perhaps in the next question where you'll see the parameters of Muktzah. I think we've got a good basis to say it's not Muktzah. To leave now, this question is to use the pram where there is an Eruv, or even within the house, where people use the buggy sometimes to soothe, to calm a child down, and to go, is the pram Muktzah? So I don't think the pram is Muktzah, even if the battery was there. But I was going out for a walk. I am concerned the person might forget and activate the motor. Therefore, if you do live in an area and you're going to take this pram out for a walk, I would say to remove the battery before Shabbos. But I don't think the battery makes the pram Muktzah. And certainly when there's no battery, for sure it's not Muktzah. Okay, so let's see where I'm coming from. So here we have this in our Shul, and someone donated. Someone's asking about a clockwork motor on the pram. Okay, I don't know what that means exactly. Is it motivating the pram? I don't know. Okay, we have here a beautiful piece of furniture in the Shul where it has a display of the various Inyonim, the Parshas Shavua, Merid Hatol, Sefirahetc. It's got lighting behind it, and you open the door in order to, behind the door, there's a bit of storage where you could take the next day's Omer number to switch over. So actually, the lights are actually on the wall behind the door. They're not on the door itself, but on the door itself, as you can see towards the top, there's this decorative neotomid of sorts, which has burning bulbs. Now, generally, we view electric lights as being Muktzah, although you don't actually do a malocha with electric lights. But that's the general perception, that electric lights are Muktzah. So does the electric light on the door make the door Muktzah? And that's, as I say, connected with the previous question about does the battery in the pram make the pram Muktzah? So let's read a piece in Shulchan Aruch. So here we have in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, it's in Siman Reish Ayin Zayin, and it says here, what about a door? A door swings on the hinges. On the door itself has been affixed a lantern, a lamp. So as you open and close the door, so then if it's an oil lamp, it's going to make the flame, the oil go up and down, and that's going to be if it makes the flame larger, so that's increasing fire mavir. If it's reducing the flame, so then it's mechaber, it's extinguishing, even though it doesn't put out the flame, but it's diminishing the flame. That's also mechaber. Like making a flame bigger is mavir, so making a flame small is mechaber. Then he says like this. Ve'ein isu betiltel hadeles b'shun ha'miner ha'muktzah kavua. Lefi she'hadeles le'nasis bosses le'neir mipnei she'hi chashuvo she'meshameshes le'bayis u'vetelo etzloi v'loi le'haneir. Don't say that the door is muksafied because it's supporting the lamp. Now, we do know the concept of bosses le'dover ha'asur. If you've left a lamp on an empty table, and the table is the pedestal for the lamp, so then not only is the lamp muktzah, but it applies a muktzah to the pedestal which is bottled to it. So that's the concept of bosses le'dover ha'asur. So that's because the table becomes a pedestal for the lamp. So the Alter Rebbe says here, that's true, but a door has got a different function. A door has got a function to open and close. Therefore, the door is there for access, to go in and out of the house. That is its primary function. So therefore, it cannot be arrested for movement because of the candle, which is on the door, because its primary function for opening, for entering, access to the house remains its main purpose, and therefore the the lamp on it doesn't dominate to make it Muktzah. And then he adds, therefore, if it's a wax candle, then you would be allowed to open and close the door, obviously slowly, that it shouldn't affect the flame. So then the bottom piece on the screen is from the Kuntras Achron, where the Alter Rebbe brings from another source, from the Torah in Nichas Chanukah, possibly the term Muktzah means transportation, of lifting an article from A to B, even within the house, but it was here, and now you've moved over to another place. But when something's on a hinge, it's not gone anywhere. Perhaps that's not called moved. Of course, I know it's moved in one way, but it hasn't been moved to another location. Possibly you can argue that's not called moving. That's an interesting concept. Let's say, besides the issue of switching off a light, it was a switch. Let's say everything's off. Is a movement of a switch from on position to off position. Is that called moving? It's not gone anywhere. So according to this svara, that's not called movement because it hasn't gone anywhere. However, the Alter Rebbe says the fact that the other Rishonim, Tosfos and the Mordechai, use the argument which was said inside, that the door's function is for access to their house, and therefore it's not Basas or Davar Asr. Evidently, they don't agree with this concept that movement of a hinged object is not called movement. So let's retrace that. So to say that because it's on a hinge, it's not a problem of movement of Muktzah, that the Alter Rebbe seems to drop, that's not a solution. So we come back, what we do say is that we have a primary thing, primary function is to open and close to be able to get into the house, then it's not bottled to the candle. So this was the question, coming back to our display here. Is it correct? Would it be correct to say that that the main function here of this door is to be able to get to the whatever stuff is inside? And the fact that there's a movement of the electric lamps on top is secondary. That's why my inclination is to say the same thing, that it does not become Muktzah, because the main thing here is it's a door on a hinge to be able to get inside and to get to whatever is available in storage there. Okay, let's move on. So someone asked me a few days ago, what's the story about a man who is Mekabel Shabbos early? Does that obligate his wife that she has to be Mekabel Shabbos early? And if she didn't, can she light candles later after her husband has already been Mekabel Shabbos? Now, I've got here a quote from the Piskei Teshuvos, one I mentioned many times. Now, this concept of the fact that the husband is Mekabel Shabbos, therefore that dominates the head of the household, his Mekabel Shabbos dominates the whole. There is a logic to it, but it isn't terribly well documented. He uses these interesting terms in Hebrew. It's rather a bit obscure. It's not so well documented. He brings a couple of poskim. So yes, the minig is indeed that that a woman would light candles before the time her husband lights candles. So before her husband is Mekabel Shabbos, sorry. Rav Moshe Feinstein, in a very interesting tshuva in Chelik Dalet Erachaim, no, sorry. Rav Moshe Feinstein is where? Okay, I can find it. It's a well-known tshuva. Rav Moshe, he says that this whole business of Kabbalah Shabbos, of the husband obligating the rest of the household, that's only if he's Mekabel Shabbos for Hidur Mitzvah. Wants to be more frum, he wants to have his Shabbos, a bigger Shabbos. So therefore, she is also kind of bound by his Hidur Mitzvah. But then he says, if you're Mekabel Shabbos for mundane rather than spiritual reasons, you want to eat supper at a more reasonable time, but nothing to do with because of Hidur Mitzvah. The proof to that is that in winter, you're not Mekabel Shabbos early, only in summer. So then he says that shouldn't be binding on the rest of the family. And he even goes further to say that the fact that shuls are Mekabel Shabbos early should also not have that binding effect. Now, I must say that most poskim disagree with Reb Moshe on this, and the standard approach is that when a shul is Mekabel Shabbos, and they are the only shul in the area, let's not go into too many details, so then the Yechidim are bound by the Kabbalah Shabbos of the Klal. We've discussed this before, even though they are Mekabel Shabbos early because they want the community want to eat supper at a reasonable time. So that's certainly lechatchila. But certainly, on the other hand, if he has been Mekabel Shabbos and she hasn't lit candles yet, one would be able to rely on Reb Moshe's approach that she should be allowed to light the candles now, of course, before Lichtzen and time, but we're talking about just because he has been Mekabel Shabbos early, that shouldn't oblige her. The other point was asked, another further detail on this, what happens if the husband is in a different time zone? And let's say he's gone to Eretz Yisrael for the week for Shabbos. So he's Mekabel Shabbos 2 hours earlier. Well, this certainly does not oblige anyone at home. He's not the Gedol HaBayis. The Gedol HaBayis is the one who's at home, the lead person, so to speak, at the home. If he's out of town, so that role of a Gedol HaBayis has, at least momentarily, has been relegated to someone else. Let's move on to a question about making for Shavuos. Children want to have an activity on Yom Tov to be able to make with the children coming to encourage them to come to hear us Sadibras. So there's a way of making ice cream apparently by putting sugar lumps. Not sugar lumps. So to put in ice and salt in a bag, and you shake it up, and somehow a bag inside a bag, and somehow that makes the inner bag turn into ice cream. So are you allowed to make ice cream on Yom Tov? So what is the question here? You're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. So why should we be making ice cream any worse? So there are those who say, but still making ice cream is a concept of moiled. You're creating a new cook. You've changed it, but you haven't changed it from yesh le'ayin. You haven't changed it to a totally different form. Whereas with making ice cream or making ice, etc., they are more concerned. But there are definitely those who are moichel, and this we got here. Now again, we've got a quote from Piskei Teshuvos. This time it's from Simon Tov Tzadik Hey, and he talks about this question. He says whipping eggs, making mayonnaise, making ice cream. So those who are moichel to make them on Yom Tov, if they didn't manage to, they recommend to do these things before Yom Tov. But if you do need to do them on Yom Tov because you didn't manage to make them before, so yes, there are ample basis, authorities who do permit this, and certainly as for children's activity to keep them entertained, I think that one certainly can be moichel to be allowed to make this ice cream on Yom Tov. I'm emphasizing this because it doesn't mean that it's a clear heter for everyone, for adults also, because there are those who are machmir, but as a children's activity, one can be moichel. Now, Moshe is pointing out, coming back to the previous question about Kabbalah Shabbos, the only shul in town, and what about you have your main shul where you daven 90% of the time? There are two schools of opinion about this. There are those who poskim, who say that it depends on your membership, so to speak, which shul you are a regular, and that's going to affect you even if you don't go to shul. That's, I think, Master Shekel takes that view. On the other hand, the Alter Rebbe does not seem to take that view at all. This business, this affiliation is irrelevant. If it's the only shul in town, then that's one thing. If all the shuls in town daven ma'ariv early again, that is an issue. But if you are intending to go to a later davening shul, then that's what we're relying on. Even the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying about the majority of town, which that makes it interesting because in this part of the world, and certainly in other parts of London, the majority of town are Makabel Shabbos early. But according to Alter Rebbe, majority of town Makabel Shabbos early. But including the Wort of Reb Moshe, well, I don't think we need to make a fuss about that. Let's move on. This is an interesting question, which I saw just now, and I was a bit surprised, and I want to share it. Reb Yossel Padver, who lives here in the area on Holney Road, he recently published a sefer of his he called it Me'il HaEphod. Ephod and Padver is the same letters. Fine. His father, Allah Shalom, published Cheshav HaEphod. His is called Me'il HaEphod. Fine. At any rate, one of the things which he addresses there is about on Shabbos pulling out the bung in a mikveh. Now, I want to explain this. There's various ways of constructing a mikveh. There's one way of having boir al gabe boir, which means that you have a reservoir of rainwater underneath, and double-decker, the upper floor, that's where the boir hatfila, where people tovel. Between those two, there is an aperture, which is about 10 centimeters square. That remains open the whole time. Then there's no question of opening the hashaka on Shabbos. Most mikvahs are not built that way. Most mikvahs are built nowadays with two pools of rainwater, two beiris, one for hashaka and one for zriya. The zriya means that the water supply from town pours into this and then overflows into the mikveh. The hashaka means that the rainwater stays in the side pool, and then we've got a pipe, which is Sefirahetc, a few inches wide, and when the two waters touch one another, so then you've got the rainwater, which is kosher, you've got the tap water, which isn't kosher. When the two bodies of water touch, then the tap water becomes kosher, and you can use it for mikveh. The question here is, are you allowed to open this bung on Shabbos? So the main thrust of Reb Yossel's article is actually as far as a very hot mikveh, and by opening the bung, you are connecting cold water with very hot water. And so then there's a question of bishul. If the water in the mikveh, he doesn't go into detail. If the water in the mikveh is yad soledesbei, and I want to tell you, for timid beings like myself, sometimes those hot mikvehs are frightening to go into. So for many people, they are yad soledesbei. So in such a mikveh, which is yad soledesbei, even though you're one of those brave guys who just march in, to pull out the bung would be a problem, because you're taking cold water. Like when you make a cup of tea on Shabbos, you make sure the glass is dry, so that the shouldn't be any drops of water getting heated up by the water from the urn. It's the same thing. You're opening the bung, and the cold water is getting in contact with the hot water. There's a different story. If you have a mikveh, it's too hot. Are you allowed to pour in gallons and gallons of cold water? Yes, you are allowed to. That's, as far as I remember, that is permitted. But here is just a minimal amount of contact. So therefore, there is a serious problem. But I don't want to deal with that so much as the problem of, is it an issue of a tikkun? You're making the water kosher. Now, you're not allowed to tovel kalim on Shabbos or Yom Tov, because you're not allowed to. It's a tikkun. You're not allowed. Someone asked me, can you take challah? Can you take Truma and Meiser on Shabbos? So the answer is no, because it's a tikkun. Although that's a spiritual tikkun, we're not allowed to make a tikkun on Shabbos. So the same thing, to open the bung, to remove the bung, and this way you're matak in the water. So that's as if you're making a tikkun. Now, I'm addressing this because there's another detail here. Once there has been, let's say there's a mikveh, which this is relevant for Tfilas Noshim, it's irrelevant for Tfilas Kelim. Let's say the bung has been removed and there has been contact between the two waters, and then bung has been then put back in place. Does the tap water remain kosher, or is it only kosher so long as the opening is still open? So the way it's written in Shulchan Aruch, quoting the Rosh, in Siman Reish Aleph, this massive Siman about Yom Kvoros, and Siman Sif Nun Beis. So the Shulchan Aruch says once it's been kashered by contact with kosher water, it's kashered la'olam. However, numerous poskim disagree with that, and they say that nifsika hashaka, when the hashaka has been interrupted, then the kashrus of the water is also lost. For this reason, when doing a serious tevilah on Shabbos, Noshim, Kalim, so then it's important that the bung is removed for the moment of that tevilah, because according to other poskim, the mikveh is only kosher so long as the contact with the make shomim is on. So now, with that introduction, now let's come back to whether it's okay to open it on Shabbos. So Rav Yossel in Me'il HaEphod, he refers to a sefer called Gidulei Tahara. It was published Tov Kuf Ayin Hey, in other words, just after the Alter Rebbe's passing. So it was possibly a contemporary. I don't know much more about the author. It's a well-known sefer. He says, Ayin Simin Yud. So he first quotes the words of the Shulchan Aruch, Nishar la'olam be'achshayrei. Hashaka was done, it remains indefinite, it remains kosher forever. He says, look at my articles at the end of the Sefer, in Siman Yud, where I've established the Ein Lahochil Bozeh. One shouldn't rely on this view that the make shomim, that the Maim Shu'uvim, the tap water remains kosher automatically. No. And then he goes further. What about then if you have a mikveh made of tap water, water brought from buckets? Are you allowed to do this hashaka, this connection on Shabbos? Perhaps it's called matakin. We find that you are allowed to take a bottle of Tommy water and connect it with kosher water on Shabbos. And it's not called matakin. But here he says, but this should be similar. There are cases, we know that normally we say ein mevatel is lechatchila. I think we discussed it a couple of weeks ago. You're not allowed to take the chatchila piece of chazer fat and mix it into a chol and say it's bottle b'shishim. So, but there are conditions where you are allowed to do that. If it's Yisrael Rabbonon, there are positions where you are allowed to be mevatel. So you wouldn't be allowed to do that on Shabbos. And so he says the following: according to the Rosh, who says that through the hashaka, it remains perpetually kosher. In Cain, you've actually fixed the water. Interesting, it's a bit counterintuitive. According to the Rosh, who says that once you connected it, it remains kosher forever, then you mustn't open the bung on Shabbos. If it wasn't open before Shabbos, yeah? If it wasn't open before Shabbos, you've got a pool full of tap water. It wasn't kashed before Shabbos. You open the bung, you've kashed that water. So according to the Rosh, you're remataking the water. But according to the stricter opinion, which says that every time you want to tovel, you have to open the bung, because it's only kosher so long as it's connected. When you close it, then it loses its kashrus. So then there's no problem to open the bung on Shabbos, because the tikkun which you're doing is only for the moment when you're toveling. You put the bung back. It's been reversed. So it's an interesting twist. So Dafka having read this through carefully, if it's not a hot mikveh, if it's a reasonably comfortable temperature, then there's no problem of bishul. And to open the bung which has been opened already, but you want to be machmir, I don't see any, according to what he says here, there's not a problem to open it because the kashrus which you're achieving is not actually changing the water to make it kosher water. It's only kind of exposing it to the kosher water, and so that's not a tikkun of the actual water. Therefore, you would be allowed to open it on Shabbos. Okay. Now I see that there's a comment here about Affixed Torah after the time the community have made Shabbos. As far as I remember, it mentions two svaras about that. And the Chatchila, when should be the community Mekabel Shabbos early, she should be make Affixed Torah early. If she didn't, she can still make Affixed Torah before actual sunset. Okay, we have one more point which we want to discuss. That's the disclaimers of the minyan. And that is, following from Hayom Yom last week, there were quite a few, there was a couple of entries in Hayom Yom about how to pronounce certain words in davening, karchoi, korchoi, etc., ma'amar. And so that in some shul in Crown Heights raised the question about a word in davening. And today's being Thursday, in the Shiur Yom of Thursday, which is Kapitel Kipei Aleph and Tilim, Batzora koroso v'achaltzeko, encho b'seser ra'am, evchoncho al mei merivo selo. So the word ra'am, is it pronounced ro'am or pronounced ra'am? So on the top of the screen, you've got here the first print of the Alter Rebbe's Sedra in Tovkov Samach Gimel, and there it's vowelized ro'am with the comments. I have about 5 or 6 early prints in facsimile, and all of them have the word, the vowel is with the comments is ro'am. Then with the second copy here is from the Torah Sedra, which I have a facsimile of Tofresh Nun Vov. So and there it's already changed. It's ra'am with a pasach. So then we have this dilemma: is it with the comments or with a pasach? The next quote you have is from our familiar Tefillin, the Oil Yosef Yitzchok Tefillin, which we use regularly. This was published, I think, in Warsaw by a company called Pirashnikov. And this was chosen by the Frierdiker Rebbe, I think, something like that. And Kahos reprinted that print. Now here you see, it's actually sorry. The one which I have in Til and Pei Aleph, which I'm pointing to now, is from a Mikroas Gedolos. And there it has again Ra'am with a Pasach. In the Tilim, the Oil Yosef Yitzchok, it has Ro'am with a komatz. So we're still in the Tilas Hashem Siddur, it was with a Pasach, and so in the Torah Osid, as you can see, it's with the Pasach, and then in Tov Shin Lamed Ches, there were, when Kahos published the English translated Siddur, they face-to-face, so then at the same time, there was a major overhaul of the Hebrew side of the Siddur, and at that time they changed it from Ra'am to Ro'am. What you have here at the bottom on the right side is from a Kuntrus Hagos, the Siddur Rabbeinu Hazakin. The Rebbe, this is, I think, in the early years, during the time of the Frierdiker Rebbe, he made lists of which things to correct and etc. And he raised the question: is it Basesa Ra'am or Komatz? Should be a Ro'am. And he says he's not sure. He raises the question. And in all the years until Tov Lamed Ches, it had been left Ra'am in all 3 Siddurim, in Torah Tilas Hashem, Torah Eir, and in the Rastova Siddur, in all of those with a Pasach. And came Tov Lamed Ches, and the editors decided to change it to a komatz, possibly because the way they saw this in the Tehillim Oil Yosef Yitzchok with the Ro'am. Now let me explain something. That because there's asnachta, which is a pause, that would lend itself to say it should be Ro'am, like you often have, like Oretz rather than Eretz, or something towards the end of a pasuk. By a pause, sometimes that influences the vowel. So seems to be a certain logic that it should be with the comments. So the fact that it's with a Pasach in so many other editions seems to be the surprise. again, counterintuitively, the one which makes less sense is probably the more correct one. In other words, packed with the comments, that's what Poshet made the comments. The fact they've made it with a Pasach may be because there's a special tradition. Now, here we have on the Tilim, in Chal Tanakh, we've got this commentary which is addressing Mesorah, addressing how words are to be spelt, etc. So on the word in the Minchas Shai, so Rav Nuretzi, who did about 400 or 500 years ago, so he writes that the word Ram, Bisforim Yeshonim, Horesh Muktzah. So in the oldest Sforim, it's with a comments. So obviously he already had then in his times also people putting it with a Pasach. Now, there's this excellent sefer by Reb Shmuel Heber, so Sein Gesund, and it's a 3-volume series on Tilim called Yashmiya Kol Tilosai, which is made like the idea of a Teretmima idea on the Tilim. So he quotes the Minchas Shai, and then he says, Ach bisforim didan, bepasach asher ze ba'asnachta. In the Sforim which we have, it's spelt with a Pasach, despite the fact that it's Nachta. Then he gives some kind of logic to it. And I also have a beautiful Tilim, which was published by the late Mr. Eljovich, who lived in Antwerp. He put out a beautiful Tilim called Tehillim Yosef Shalom. And he did a lot of research on the exact way how to spell the words, and the vowels, etc. And he also brings from strong sources, authentic sources, that it should be with the Pasach. So listen, whichever way you're saying is fine, but it looks like that despite the earlier prints of the Alter Rebbe Siddur were with comments, but at the later stage, it was accepted that it should be switched to a Pasach, and the fact that it was then switched back to a comments, well, it seems interesting. Well, if they'd ever left it as an open question, but the fact they left it as it should be with the Pasach seems to tell me that he was okay, that it should stay with the Pasach. I'll leave you with that and stop now, a couple of minutes early. I have a bar mitzvah tonight to go to, and I'm sure everyone else has also other things to go to do. So I wish you a good night and a good Shabbos, and Allah soll sein gesund, and Tomen Kol Hayomim, and Kol Shlema Mashiach Tzidkenu.